As we continue walking through the Bible story, we see that after being delivered from Egypt, the Israelites eventually came to the Sinai wilderness and camped in front of the mountain. And when the Israelites were at Mount Sinai, God gave instructions for the people to be prepared for God to speak to them. And Moses was called up on the mountain. God was now prepared to give the details of his covenant with the Israelites. Let's begin this portion of our study as we continue thinking in the book of Exodus. We come very early here as we come into Exodus chapter 20 to what we call the Ten Commandments. God spoke in the hearing of all the people and gave the 10 commandments to them. Let's read in Exodus 20 and the first 17 verses. Then God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Do not have other gods besides me. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow and worship to them, and do not serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. You are to labor 6 days and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female servant, your livestock, or the resident alien who is within your city gates. For the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and everything in them in 6 days. Then he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not give false testimony against your neighbor. Do not covet your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's wife, his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. And so, here are these commandments that were given in the hearing of all the people. And these commandments, though they are not the entire law, not the entire covenant that God gave to the Israelites, these form the foundation of the law for Israel. And they would be written by God on stone tablets that were to be kept inside of the Ark of the Covenant. And we'll talk more about that in just a little while. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 4 through 5. God began by identifying himself back in verse 2 as the Lord your God. Now, he's referenced himself in this way before. This is what you might call the Tetragrammaton. YHWH would be the letters, the equivalent letters for the Hebrew here. YHWH, often pronounced Yahweh or Jehovah. So God is identifying himself as the one who had brought them out of slavery in Egypt, as we looked at in the last lesson. And then you walk through and you carefully consider all of the commands that God has given. The command that they were to have no other gods besides God. We need to remember that as we keep going through our study here. Have no other gods. This God, Jehovah God, is the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Don't have other gods besides me. Don't make idols. right? Not even representing this God. Don't make idols for yourself. Again, we'll keep that in mind as we keep our study here and later on in this lesson. Don't misuse the name of God. Remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. That God would give specific instructions, as he does here, but he will also give other specific instructions about the Sabbath day, the seventh day. That it was to be set apart from the other days. They were to honor their father and their mother, not to murder, not to commit adultery, not to steal, not to give false testimony, and not to covet. Right? These various aspects of these 10 commandments that we can see instructions about that are kind of directed toward God particularly, and then also how they're to deal with other people. But after all the sights and all the sounds that were involved in God speaking to the people from the mountain, the people, their reaction, they were afraid. They wanted Moses to speak to them in the future. Look in verses 18 through 21. All the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the ram's horn, and the mountain surrounded by smoke. When the people saw it, they trembled and stood at a distance. "You speak to us, and we will listen," they said to Moses. "But don't let God speak to us, or we will die." Moses responded to the people, "Don't be afraid, for God has come to test you so that you will fear him and will not sin." And the people remained standing at a distance as Moses approached the total darkness where God was. So the people, when they hear all this and see all these sights, they want Moses to speak to us instead of hearing directly then from God as they did with the 10 Commandments. But then, as we continue, we also see that there were additional laws. So in addition to the 10 Commandments, because that again was not the only part of this covenant that God was making with his people, in addition to those 10 Commandments, God spoke other laws to Moses. And that was in the reading for the week, that you can look at the details on all that. Some are recorded in Exodus and in the passages that we were reading. Others will be recorded later. And we'll see some of that as we look in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. And there's various things that God had revealed to Moses that were all kind of composing or part of this law that they were to live under. Ultimately, in all of these laws, the people would have to make a decision. They would have to decide whether they were going to make God, Jehovah God, their God, whether they were going to keep his laws, or whether they were not going to make him their God, whether they were not going to keep his laws. And through these laws, God would prepare the Israelites to be a different sort of people. When you compared with the other nations of the world, even at that time, this people, God was preparing them to be different, to be holy, to be set apart. Also included in the laws God gave were instructions concerning 3 specific festivals that were introduced to us that were to be kept. Look in Exodus 23, verses 14 through 17. Though these are not the only times that were to be set apart, that were special to God, these are 3 particular ones that are called out for us in this text. It says, "Celebrate a festival in my honor 3 times a year. Observe the festival of unleavened bread. As I commanded you, you are to eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of Abib, because you came out of Egypt in that month. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Also observe the festival of harvest with the firstfruits of your produce from what you sow in the field, and observe the festival of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather your produce from the field. 3 times a year, all your males are to appear before the Lord God." So we've got these 3 specific festivals that were to be observed, identified here in this text. The festival of unleavened bread, we can also see that being referred to as Passover, which was remembering when God brought them out of Egypt, as we talked about very briefly in the last lesson, and how God had instituted that at that time, and how this was to be a reminder to not only them, but then to their children, all future generations, of how God had brought Israel out of Egypt. They were to observe the festival of the harvest, or the festival of weeks. It's called Pentecost in the New Testament, which is celebrating the first fruits of the harvest. And the festival of ingathering, or the festival of shelters, celebrating the end of the year harvest. On all these occasions, all the males were to appear before Jehovah. And there were promised blessings if the Israelites would keep all these various laws that were laid out. And if they would be God's people, there would be blessings for that. And there would be consequences if they did not. Let's read Exodus 23, verses 20 through 33. It says, I am going to send an angel before you to protect you on the way and bring you to the place I have prepared. Be attentive to him and listen to him. Do not defy him, because he will forgive your acts of rebellion, for my name is in him. But if you will carefully obey him and do everything I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and a foe to your foes. For my angel will go before you and bring you to the land of the Amorites, Hethites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites, and I will wipe them out. Do not bow and worship to their gods, and do not serve them. Do not imitate their practices. Instead, demolish them and smash their sacred pillars to pieces. Serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water. I will remove illnesses from you. No woman will miscarry or be childless in your land. I will give you the full number of your days. I will cause the people ahead of you to feel terror and will throw into confusion all the nations you come to. I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you in retreat. I will send hornets in front of you, and they will drive out the Hivites, Canaanites, and Hethites away from you. I will not drive them out ahead of you in a single year. Otherwise, the land would become desolate, and wild animals would multiply against you. I will drive them out little by little ahead of you until you have become numerous and take possession of the land. I will set your borders from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates River. For I will place the inhabitants of the land under your control, and you will drive them out ahead of you. You must not make a covenant with them or their gods. They must not remain in your land, or else they will make you sin against me. If you serve their gods, it will be a snare for you. Again, recognize here's these laws God had given. Here's this covenant he's trying to enter. Here's the details. And if you keep this, here's what God's going to do. And God's always faithful. He will do exactly what he says, and he will bring the people into this land, and he will bless them and all of these things. But if you don't, if you go after these other gods, if you don't keep God's law, well, there's going to be consequences for that. And we'll watch that as we keep going throughout the Bible story as well. So then we see that Israel enters a covenant with Jehovah. A covenant involves an agreement between at least two parties. In this case, it was Jehovah God who offered for the Israelites to be his special people, so as to be in an agreement with him. Moses spoke the words of God to the people, who responded by saying that they would obey everything the Lord had commanded. Look in Exodus 24, verses 3 and 4. It says, Moses came and told the people all the commands of the Lord and all the ordinances. Then all the people responded with a single voice, "We will do everything that the Lord has commanded." And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early the next morning and set up an altar and 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel at the base of the mountain. So then we see that the law was written, sacrifices were made, the covenant scroll was read, and blood was splattered upon the people to enter the covenant with God. As we continue in Exodus 24, and we start in verse 5, then he sent out young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half the blood and set it in basins. The other half of the blood he splattered on the altar. Then he took the covenant scroll and read it aloud to the people. They responded, "We will do and obey all that the Lord has commanded." Moses took the blood, splattered it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you concerning all these words." And so the Israelites now, having been told the laws of God, the covenant that God was offering, they enter into this agreement. They agree, we will do all that God has said and become his people in this way. But we see then that Israel breaks the covenant. After agreeing to this covenant, God called Moses back up the mountain for 40 days and nights. We see in Exodus 24 and verse 18 how he remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. But while he was there, we see that the Israelites violated what God had said. They urged Aaron, Moses' brother, to make gods for them who would go before them. Exodus 32 and verse 1, when the people saw that Moses delayed in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us, who will go before us, because this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." And so this time that Moses has remained up on the mountain, and now the people are quickly ready to abandon this, or at least in the way that they should. Under Aaron's leadership, the Israelites made a golden calf. And it's interesting, right, because the calf would have been an image that was common to Egyptian and Canaanite culture. And so you can see them going back to what they knew instead of walking in this new covenant that they had entered with God. This image was then proclaimed to be the God who had led them up from Israel and was worshipped. We read now in Exodus 32, starting in verse 2 and down through verse 6. Aaron replied to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings that were on their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, fashioned it with an engraving tool, and made it into an image of a calf. Then they said, "Israel, these are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of it and made an announcement, "There will be a festival to the Lord tomorrow." Early the next morning they rose, offered burnt offerings, and presented fellowship offerings. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up to party. And you can see how this was clearly a violation of the covenant that they had made with God, and God was angry with them. He had told them to have no other gods besides me. He had told them not to make any idol from anything, even of him. No idol, no other gods, and now here it is in this short time following that now that's exactly where they are. And they have made this golden calf. And now God was angry with them. He was angry with them to the point that he spoke to Moses of destroying them. Exodus 32, continuing now in verse 7 and going through verse 10. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Go down at once, for your people you brought up from the land of Egypt have acted corruptly. They have quickly turned from the way I commanded them. They have made for themselves an image of a calf. They have bowed down to it, sacrificed to it, and said, Israel, these are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt. The Lord also said to Moses, I have seen this people, and they are indeed a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger can burn against them, and I can destroy them, then I will make you into a great nation. Here are these people. Notice they're not God's people anymore in how he references them. Notice that your people, he tells Moses, that you brought up from Egypt, they have turned their backs on God. And there's consequences for doing that. And he's ready to destroy them and speaks of that. But Moses, however, spoke to God concerning the covenant that he had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God relented, as we continue in Exodus 32 and verses 11 through 14. But Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. Lord, why does your anger burn against your people you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and a strong hand? Why should the Egyptians say, he brought them out with an evil intent to kill them in the mountains and eliminate them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger and relent concerning this disaster planned for your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. You swore to them by yourself and declared, I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky, and will give your offspring all this land that I have promised, and they will inherit it forever. So the Lord relented concerning the disaster he said he would bring on his people. And so again, we see this reference clearly to the covenant, the promises that he had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Israel. And God, of course, is not going to give up on his promises. And God was going to deal with the people who had turned away from him, but he would not completely and utterly destroy them. When Moses came to the people, we see that he smashed the tablets with God's writing on them, which was symbolic, of course, of the broken covenant. They had already broken their part of this covenant. God never breaks his part of the covenant. Exodus 32, verses 15 through 16, and verse 19. And we see that then Moses destroyed the idol in verse 20. And God inflicted a plague on the people, verse 35. And afterwards, then, we see that God gave 2 new stone tablets to Moses with the same words of the covenant on them. Exodus 34, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, cut 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. They can't get away from these words. Even in breaking the tablets, God's going to put the same words on them. Verses 4 through 8, Moses cut 2 stone tablets like the first ones. He got up early in the morning, and taking the 2 stone tablets in his hand, he climbed Mount Sinai just as the Lord had commanded him. The Lord came down in a cloud, stood with him there, and proclaimed his name, the Lord. The Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord. The Lord is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in faithful love and truth, maintaining faithful love to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, rebellion, and sin. But he will not leave the guilty unpunished, bringing the consequences of the father's iniquity on the children and grandchildren to the 3rd and 4th generation. Moses immediately knelt low on the ground and worshipped. So, God had entered this covenant with Israel, but Israel broke the covenant. And then we see this re-entering, if you will, of the covenant. And now, before we close, one of the other significant pieces during this part of the readings were also then the tabernacle and the priestly garments. Part of what God revealed to Moses were the details concerning the sanctuary, that is the tabernacle or the tent, and the various elements that would be used in the worship and service of God. Exodus 25, verses 8 and 9. They are to make a sanctuary for me, so that I may dwell among them. You must make it according to all that I show you. The pattern of the tabernacle as well as the pattern of all its furnishings. So God was going to dwell among the Israelites, his people, and they were to make this sanctuary, this tabernacle for them, and there was a pattern that God had given, and all of it was to be made according to the pattern God gave to Moses. Exodus 25, verse 40, be careful to make them according to the pattern you have been shown on the mountain. This tabernacle would have a courtyard and would have two sections. It would have the holy place and the most holy place. Look in chapter 26, verses 33 through 35. It says, hang the curtain under the clasps and bring the ark of the testimony there behind the curtain. So the curtain will make a separation for you between the holy place and the most holy place. Put the mercy seat on the ark of the testimony in the most holy place. Place the table outside the curtain and the lampstand on the south side of the tabernacle opposite the table. Put the table on the north side. And so we can see these different pieces of furniture that would be involved, and we can see these two sections, the most holy place and the holy place. In the courtyard for the tabernacle would be the altar of burnt offering and the bronze basin or the laver. In the holy place of the tabernacle would be the lampstand, would be the table for the bread of the presence, and the altar of incense, which would be in front of the curtain, which divided the holy place from the most holy place. And then entering through the curtain in the most holy place was the Ark of the Covenant with the mercy seat. The mercy seat would be the lid on this Ark of the Covenant. Remember, inside of this would be the tablets that God would write with his finger, the commandments. We also see that utensils and oil and fabric and various items were also involved in God's instructions, and those details are all given throughout the latter half of the book of Exodus. In addition, God gave specific instructions concerning the garments for the one who would serve as high priest, and initially that's going to be Aaron, and for the other priests. We'll learn more about those as we continue on as far as the priests. The high priest's garments included an ephod, a breastpiece, a robe, and a turban. And God gave specific instructions for all these items, and they were made according to God's pattern. Let's read in Exodus 39, verses 42 and 43. The Israelites had done all the work according to everything the Lord had commanded Moses. Moses inspected all the work they had accomplished. They had done just as the Lord commanded. Then Moses blessed them. And then we see that when the tabernacle was set up and the garments were put on, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Exodus 40, verses 34 through 38. It says, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. The Israelites set out whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle throughout all the stages of their journey. If the cloud was not taken up, they did not set out until the day it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and there was a fire inside the cloud by night, visible to the entire house of Israel throughout all stages of their journey. As we close this lesson, we see that God has entered a covenant with the Israelites. More details will be given concerning this covenant as we continue through the books of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. However, we should plainly see God's desire to keep the promises he had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and for the Israelites to be a special people to him in the process.